Perfectly, didn't he? Just like fade out. Now we transition from seal to me. All right, so I'm going to be talking to you guys about progressive enhancement and specifically about kind of dispelling some myths about progressive enhancement. And this is actually a very, very, very condensed version of an hour-and-a-half long talk that Jen Lucas and I gave at UX Immersion Mobile. So she did a lot of the slide design, so my hat tips to Jen Lucas on that. And Matt Sutter, her husband, did all of the illustration work, which is fantastic. I love this guy's jumpsuit over here. It's just like a onesie. Anyway, I'm Aaron Gustafson. Some of you may know me from my work with the Web Standards Project and my book, Adaptive Web Design, which is about progressive enhancement. But before I dive into kind of dispelling myths about progressive enhancement, I want to make sure that I get everybody on the same page as to what progressive enhancement is. So progressive enhancement is a philosophy of web design that's all about creating experiences that don't have any technological restrictions. So the idea is that you create one experience that is universally available, universally accessible, will work anywhere, and then you build up the experience as opportunity allows. So as you have the Ben Ho, a designer from Australia, called it opportunities for sexiness in your experiences. As you have those opportunities, you take advantage of those to create better and better experiences for your users. And in practice, the way that we do that is by applying the experience in layers. So we start with the content and the key tasks that users need to be able to accomplish no matter what. And then we enhance those with semantics. So we add extra meaning to the document using HTML. We then apply design as an enhancement to that page in order to establish visual hierarchy, guide users through the page, reinforce branding, that sort of stuff. We then use interactivity, obviously, to make an experience much more engaging, to make things faster, to have less page refreshes, that sort of stuff. So, all right, when I talk about progressive enhancement a lot, I always get pushback from various verticals within the web industry. So I'm going to walk through, I think it's 6 different verticals and some of the challenges that they're dealing with and how progressive enhancement can be used to address those. So here we have the news vertical. So certainly we couldn't use progressive enhancement in news. So Reddit is the #1 news site in the world, and they have a wonderfully usable site on mobile devices and small screens. No, they're not optimizing an experience at all for anything that's small. If they do notice that you are on a mobile device, this is, by the way, the mobile experience on the iPhone. They're using a viewport meta tag to make it stick to 1024 pixels wide. So you get the nice 30,000-foot view, which we all love, so we have to pinch and zoom to get into it. But they have a little notice there, hey, it looks like you're on a mobile device. Would you like the mobile layout? And you can go over to their MDOT solution, which is much more readable. It's much more tailored to actually presenting the content first and to getting you into that as opposed to kind of sticking you into this layout that they're enforcing on you. But when we think about this, like this experience should be the experience that anybody is having regardless of the size screen that they happen to be on, right? That's the spirit of what they're trying to do on the larger screen. It's just not actually getting across. And that's what progressive enhancement's all about. We start with the core experience that you want everybody to have, and then we enhance it as we have the opportunity to do so. So if we take the lessons we learn from our mobile site strategy, we can apply those to our desktop strategy, tablet strategy, whatever's in the middle, that squishy middle between very, very tiny screens and very, very large screens. And that's what BBC News did. They actually kind of did a little bit of a covert thing. They had their desktop site, and then they did have a separate mobile site. And what they decided to do was they converted the mobile site over to responsive, and they did it kind of under the radar. They did it bit by bit, section by section, because only mobile devices were hitting the MDOT site for the most part. But if somebody happened to be on a desktop machine and they hit the MDOT site and they got the responsive layout that worked for a larger screen too, so be it. Great, no problem. But it allowed them the flexibility to work on building up that responsive experience. And then once they'd finished the entirety of the site, they were able to kind of flip the switch. and take it from being this as the experience on a small screen, viewing the normal site, to actually having a fully responsive one. This is a great quote from Nico. So, developed a new version of the site, uses responsive design so they can offer the best experience to their users, because the point of having a news site is to get your content out to people, right? So the total effort ended up taking about 4 years and about 50 contributors and over 5,000 pull requests, but in the end, they ended up with a single code base as opposed to having to manage 2 or more, and they were able to support 30 languages, which is pretty impressive. And overall, from a design perspective, not much changed. They refined it a little bit, but the overall grid structure and such was largely the same between the old version and the new version, which is pretty neat. And so now they have this responsive site that will adapt to whatever the screen size is, providing the best possible reading experience and showcasing the actual purpose of the site, which is to read the content that they have produced there or review the videos or what have you, presenting it in the best way possible. So the way John Cleveley referred to it, he said, looking back, mobile first was the best way that we could have gone. We focused on what mattered to users, which was the journalism. That was the whole point. It wasn't about doing flashy stuff. Now, another challenge that we deal with within the news world is, of course, how we pay for all of the great journalism that we have, which we do with advertising. Now, CNN is the third largest news site in the world. And they actually have an interesting approach to mobile or to advertising. So they have a responsive site too, and on a small screen, they have these little small screen ads, and they just adjust the placement of those ads as you get onto increasingly larger screens, to the point where when you get to a really big screen, they actually strip it in and give them a nice big background that I'm sure the advertisers are just like, oh, this is amazing, so much branding. But it doesn't fight with the content. The content is still front and center. We're not like throwing up massive banner ads that peel away the page and then ads pop out and stuff like that. So it is possible to have a progressively enhanced mobile-first responsive site that actually does well with advertising and honors the content, which is the whole purpose. All right, so let's jump over to another vertical, healthcare. There have, of course, been a lot of healthcare-related issues in the States with the kind of debacle with healthcare.gov, where the site just didn't work. But healthcare is an incredibly important thing that we have to deal with, and in the States we have to deal with insurance companies. And so Blue Cross Blue Shield of Tennessee was my insurance company, and they have a way for me to log into my account, get what's been paid out and all that sort of stuff. And this is kind of a typical pattern we see elsewhere, not just in healthcare. And so this would be the expectation that you'd click on this login, register for access thing, and you'd get this login box. And that's great if you've got JavaScript. If you don't, nothing happens. The reason is that that's just a link that's a hash, an octothorpe. It doesn't actually do anything. It doesn't work at all. Now, the problem with this is that, obviously, without JavaScript, it doesn't work. But I think a lot of us assume that JavaScript is always available. And that's a bit of a misconception, because there's a lot of things that can cause JavaScript to not be available. Now, you might wonder, how many people are missing out on JavaScript-based enhancement? And it's going to vary from project to project. But the UK's Government Digital Services did a study, and I won't get into the specifics of how they did the study in too much detail, but they discovered that 1.1% of their users did not get JavaScript-based enhancements. Okay? And they conducted this study in a way where they used 3 images, one that was always in the page as an image tag, one that was inside of a no-script tag, and one that was one that was generated in via JavaScript. And the expectation was that everybody would get the first image, that people who didn't have JavaScript would get the second image, and that people who did have JavaScript would get the first and the third image, right? But what they discovered was that 0.2% of their users got the no-script version. 0.9% only got that first image. So by all accounts, they should have had the JavaScript enhancement, because no-script was never evaluated. But they never got that. And that's the vast majority of their no JavaScript use case. And there's a number of reasons that that could happen, from the JavaScript not getting downloaded to browser plugins and stuff like that causing the JavaScript execution to stop. But that's 1 in 93 people that don't get the JavaScript-based enhancement on the government digital services website. Now, you could, like ehealthinsurance.com here, throw up a little message saying, hey, you could have a better experience if you just turned on JavaScript. Let me show you how easy it is. But the reality is that if somebody gets this message, they may actually have JavaScript on. It doesn't address that situation. You know, there was a thing recently in the UK where Sky Broadband accidentally flagged jQuery from the jQuery CDN as malware. And so they blocked jQuery from the jQuery CDN for all of their subscribers for a couple days, because I think it was over a weekend. So if your site depended on jQuery from the jQuery CDN in order to actually give any content to your site was dead in the water. Okay? So a better approach to this particular situation would have been simply to put an ID on the form, make the link, or use CSS to hide the form by default, and then make the link actually point to that form, and then use CSS to show it when it's targeted, because we can use the target pseudoclass selector to address an element that is being targeted by the hash in the URL, and then make the form display. We could even use CSS transitions or animations to make it really fancy, right? Or the alternate, even simpler thing is just make it point to a friggin' login page, right? That'll work for anybody, no matter what. All right. We'll come back to a healthcare example, another healthcare example a little bit later on. But I want to talk a little bit about higher education because they deal with a problem that basically higher education and very large organizations deal with, and that's navigation. Navigation is a real challenge, especially when you have a ton of links and subnavs and different types of navigation, and especially if you want to deal with large screen, small screen, touch, mouse, yada, yada, yada. There's so many different ways that people may need to interact with your navigation options. So if we take a look at how nichols.edu does it, they have these kind of large drawer drop-downs for the sub-navigation for their site, and they have these little teasers that show up on the right-hand side when the drawer comes down. And then they've got some navigation along the top as well, and there's some navigation in the footer. And so they addressed a couple of different scenarios with their progressive enhancement approach. So by default, so if there's no JavaScript and small screen is assumed by default, what they have is they've got a hamburger menu, which is a jump ref to the navigation. So when you click on it, it will jump you to the bottom of the page. So there's the hamburger menu up there at the top. If I click on it, it'll go down to the bottom. And you'll actually see this is a slightly wider than a smartphone screen, so they have the navigation even in 2 columns, so they're even enhancing it in that way so that if you're on a bigger screen, they're not taking up quite as much vertical space with the navigation. So that's a pretty solid baseline that'll work for anybody. And any browser would be capable of doing that, which is pretty sweet. If there was JavaScript, but you were still on a small screen, they use the hamburger menu to actually toggle an off-screen menu. So they take that same navigation list and they simply use CSS to position it off the screen, and then they adjust a class on the HTML element which slides the entire body and the navigation over. And they do some adjustments to fix, like adjust fixed positioning and overflow and stuff so you can't scroll both places at once. But this is what that ends up looking like. And then they actually still expose the subnav if you click on the arrows up and down, or you could click on the main piece in order to go through to the landing pages for those sections. So that works really well. Then for larger screens, they have a couple of different things that they do. Whether there's JavaScript or not, they allow you to see the subnav by hovering over the different menu items, and that shows the CSS. If you have JavaScript as well, they handle the tab movement. As you're hitting tab on the keyboard, it will bring focus into each of those navigation items and then let you move to the subnav items as well, which is pretty nice, and it opens up those drawers even if you're not using the mouse so that you can potentially, if you're a power user, see what it is that you're going through in those nav. But also for touchscreen, they make it so that the main links still go to landing pages so that folks can get through to that and then get to the subnav from there. And without JavaScript, they just don't load the additional kind of teaser content that they have for those navigation drawers. So you can handle navigation in a very progressively enhanced way. Now, of course, financial services, they've got all kinds of other considerations dealing with charts and graphs and all that sort of stuff. So certainly progressive enhancement couldn't work there. You might have things like a real-time stock ticker, or this could be any sort of statistical information coming back from your server or what have you. But when you've got real-time updating stuff, like I like to think back to how did we solve these issues in the Web 1.0 world, right? Because we did have these same issues. We had the stock tickers and stuff like that back in Web 1.0. Well, we solved it with like a refresh button that would just cause the page to refresh. That's okay. It's not a great experience, but it still lets somebody update the information and they can still see when it was last updated. So that's a pretty good fallback. And then if the user has JavaScript and we can make AJAX calls to the back end, then we can go ahead and get rid of that button and then take it over and update the information in real time, which is pretty cool. But that's a pretty simple example. What about a slightly more complicated interaction? What if we want to have something like this? Right, surely that would require some JavaScript. Well, anyone who was in my forums talk earlier knows that this actually does not require JavaScript now. We can use the data list element to create a list of suggestions for inputs. So if we want to give some options to people, some suggestions as to the types of things that they could type, we can use a data list and give it an ID, and then we just associate that with, where is it here? The list attribute is an ID reference to that data list, and then we get that for free. You could use JavaScript to polyfill it for older browsers if you want to, but if somebody doesn't have JavaScript and they don't have data list support, it's just an input, and they can still put in what they think is a stock ticker symbol, and if they're wrong, you can make some suggestions. Like you can still give them a baseline experience that's going to work for them regardless. Now, here's another interface that might seem a little bit more involving JavaScript in terms of creating some interaction. I don't know if you can see that green all that well, but as you're moving through, there's 4 lines in the table. As you click on each line, it actually brings up stories about that stock ticker on the right-hand side. So surely something like this would require JavaScript, right? Nope, we can actually do this purely in markup as well. In HTML5, we have the data list, or sorry, not the data list, the details and summary elements. And with details and summary, what happens is that the contents of a details element are hidden by default. And for browsers, and when a user clicks on the summary, the contents of the details element are exposed. So the summary is always exposed, and clicking it exposes or hides the content that's not inside the summary. So using this approach, what they've actually done is they have a definition list for the different pieces of that table display because it's establishing that same sort of relationship, the last price, the symbol, etc. And all of that is inside of the summary. And then when you click on that, it brings up the additional headlines and the stock ticker for the entire thing. So to kind of map it out for those of you who are a little bit more visual, the blue is actually the contents of the details element, the entire contents. The red box here is the summary, and then this is the extra content, the div that contains the stock ticker graph and the headlines. So all of that could be accomplished purely with HTML. Again, you could polyfill it for older browsers if JavaScript's available, and they don't support that. But if not, all of that content would be exposed by default because HTML would ignore the details and summary elements and just expose their contents. So it would still be available to people, which is pretty sweet. All right, so we can move on here. So e-commerce is another area where people give pushback to progressive enhancement. But let's look at a little bit of information here in terms of performance. So at 100 milliseconds, that's about how long it takes for a user to feel like once it's over 100 milliseconds, the user doesn't feel like it's instantaneous anymore. Okay? At a second, you're losing their flow. All right, and at 10 seconds, they're more likely to lose interest. They're probably going to be multitasking, and they may just disappear entirely. So we want to keep uninterrupted flow, so keep things at around a second for render time if we can. That should be our target. And then we, of course, know that 40% of people abandon a website if it takes more than 3 seconds to load. Now, Walmart.com and Staples.com have released some stats that they've found based on render times. And Walmart found that every second of load time improvement, conversions increased by 2%. And Staples saw a 10% increase for that same amount of time, which is pretty awesome. So obviously, faster is better, especially in the world of e-commerce. But of course, our pages have been steadily growing larger and larger and larger. So in terms of e-commerce sites, the top 100 e-commerce pages take, on average, 6.5 seconds to load. And that's just to do their initial render and 11.4 seconds to fully load. So we really need to be considering our image strategy because images are the main killer in most of the e-commerce scenarios. If we look at a couple of different e-commerce sites, we can see that they range from everywhere just over half a megabyte to 12.28 megabytes for a website. It's probably responsive though, so it's all right. No, we really need to be considerate about our images. So let's look at Banana Republic, which weighs in at about 3.5 megs. 2.67 of that is images. So here we, of course, if we inspect it, we have the Banana Republic logo, which you'd probably expect to be an image, right? So we'll mark that as an image. Well, this big image, we would assume that would be an image too. And then, yeah, these bits up here that talk about their other brands, those are certainly images. And this little American flag, right? Well, we've got the free shipping, that's an image, the checkout, the search, the nav here, all this gray bar, this gradient in the background that could be done with CSS gradients, this navigation here, you see it just all keeps adding up. And we're only at like, what, probably 1/8 of the page height. So they have just a ton of images that we could get rid of or not have the need for if we actually used modern approaches to web design. So if we start to put some of that text actually in HTML text, if we use web fonts if we absolutely need to, but I'm sure a lot of that text could probably be done purely in normal text. We could use SVG, we could use CSS gradients certainly for that upper gradient bar. There's no reason that needs to be an image because each of these images needs to be requested. We're not at HTTP2 yet, so it's not like it's a solid stream of content that's coming through. You have to build up and tear down each one of those connections in order to get those assets. And then we have the picture and source set and sizes attributes which we can use for responsive images. I'm going to walk through a couple of these approaches just to kind of highlight them. Here's a Nasty Gal, and they have a responsive site. And this sale thing, as you get smaller and smaller, they just shrink the image. Because, right, that's what you do in responsive design, right? You can read that fine print. Sure. Obviously, we don't want to do that. Land's End has a little bit better approach in that they've got this big hero image promo. And as you shrink down the page, what you'll see is that it switches to a different layout to be more accommodating of the screen resolution that you have and to keep it legible. So that's pretty good. The problem is that in the markup, they have both of those images. So you have to download both of those images no matter which one you're seeing. We can avoid this by simply using the picture element. The picture element is a new part of the adaptive images spec, and it allows us to define alternate images for alternate scenarios. So what we have here is the picture element on the outside, and we have a source. Now this source will be applied only when this media query is met, so only when we have a minimum width of 767 pixels, which was the cutoff their JavaScript happened to be using that swapped those two. And then we have the baseline image, which is the mobile one, which is obviously the way that we want to start out. We want to have that baseline. And what do you know? This works pretty darn well. Browser support is still growing. This is a fairly new spec, but there is a polyfill that's called picture fill that you can get and you can use for browsers that actually support JavaScript, and that'll allow you to use picture and the source set and sizes attributes, which are other options for being able to just have an image tag with some alternate images. Picture is used more for art direction where you want to swap images. Source set and sizes is more often used for when you just want to provide different alternative renderings of the same image at different sizes. But I'll let you look into a little bit more of that. But even if you don't have picture fill, if you don't have JavaScript, the fallback is simply the small screen version, and that's okay even on a large screen. So another approach to reducing our overall image load is to use SVG. And those of you who were in Val's talk earlier, she talked quite a bit about SVG and how awesome it is. And it is indeed pretty awesome. And Forever 21, which is a retail store, I don't know if they have them over here in Europe. They're kind of all over the US. But they're actually using an inline SVG for their logo, which saves even a request to the server again. And it's not all that big of an SVG. SVG support is pretty darn good. There's a little bit of spotty support in some of the Android browsers, and IE8 does not support SVG, like basic SVG stuff. So for that reason, they use a conditional comment, and then they just deliver a div with a class of logo-IE only to IE8. So they've got an alternative there, and that would strip in probably a ping or a GIF that would be that alternative. Now, Sarah Sweden actually points out that you can use the picture element. This is rather small, and so you can't really see it all that well, but you can use the picture element, and you could have your source have a type. So type equals image/SVG plus XML, and then you have your path to your SVG, and then the normal image inside of there is your ping-based fallback, or what have you. So if the browser doesn't support picture, you get the fallback ping. If the browser supports picture but doesn't support SVG, you get the fallback ping. But if the browser supports picture and SVG, then you get the SVG version. So this is a fairly simple way to deal with this, to accommodate it. All right, now my absolute favorite, and my favorite illustration from this entire thing. I love this guy. One guy's putting all of his money on JavaScript. The other guy's got a coin he's putting on Flash. So, fun stuff. So in the single-page app world, this is where we probably get the most pushback against progressive enhancement because there is so much focus on JavaScript. But I want to kind of define a single-page app versus the traditional Web 1.0 model of building a site. So in Web 1.0, anything that you were doing, any interaction with the page that changed something significant would require a round trip to the server, and the server would spit back the additional markup that you needed or spit back a new page rather that had the adjusted rendering, or took you to your checkout or what have you. So the process of something happening is that the browser would request a page, the server would respond with a page, and then the browser would display the page. There's a few more steps, that's a bit simplified, but that's essentially what would happen in order to get to a page load, right? Now, in the single-page app world, things are a little bit different. You're basically replacing the server with JavaScript, okay? And so to get to page load, the browser requests a web page, the server delivers an HTML shell and a reference to the JavaScript framework. The browser then has to download, parse, and execute the JavaScript framework to get it into memory, and then the framework begins requesting the actual web page content, and then the server delivers those as little bits and pieces, and then the browser finally displays a web page. Obviously, a few more steps here to get to rendering. Tom Dale, who created the Ember framework, boldly said, at some point recently, the browser transformed from being an awesome interactive document viewer into being the world's most advanced, widely distributed application runtime. And this is when he declared progressive enhancement dead. JavaScript, all the things. We love JavaScript, right? The upside, we have a more native app-like feel. We have less reliance on the server, whatever that is. And we have more JavaScript, so it's automatically awesome because JavaScript is awesome. The downside is we've got more JavaScript, which means it's slower to get to page load, and on top of that, we're executing in an unknown environment. Now, I'll tackle each of those in turn. So from a slower perspective, the filament group did a study where they took the exact same application and built it in Angular, Backbone, and Ember. And then they tested it in 3 different scenarios, the first being a PC with a cable connection, the second being a PC over a 3G connection, and then the third being a Nexus 5 over a 3G connection, and looked how long it took them to get to first render in each of those scenarios. Backbone didn't do too bad. On a PC on a cable connection, it actually downloaded and rendered in 0.29 seconds. That's pretty awesome. Whereas at the long end, a Nexus 5 over 3G, it took Ember 5 seconds to get to render. That's an eternity, right? We've already lost them. And the reason is that processors on mobile devices are slower, right? Not only do we have the network latency issues and the network connectivity issues, but we're also dealing with these lower powered devices that in some cases may not even be capable of downloading and loading all of your content into memory. I remember Brad Frost did some research into the different presidential sites during the last presidential race in the States, and the Obama for America site would not load in a BlackBerry 5. It ran out of RAM. This stuff happens, right? Back in 2011, Gawker Media launched their newest, at that time, web platform for all of their properties, so Lifehacker, Gawker, Jezebel, et cetera, and they made it a JavaScript framework so that they could make it more responsive. And I mean, honestly, we're talking about blogs here. They're content sites. They're effectively news sites. But there was one small problem. One of the developers had a bug in the JavaScript. So this was the experience that every user on every one of their sites got because that bug made it out into production. Because your JavaScript is an application, and if it doesn't run properly, it can stop altogether. They later updated so that you got a nice little spinner telling you that content was coming, even though if JavaScript wasn't available or something had messed up your JavaScript, nothing was ever coming. So nice user experience. Now, I'm not trying to shit all over JavaScript. I love JavaScript. I write it all the time. But I also recognize that relying on JavaScript is an awful lot like building a house of cards. There's so many things that can go wrong. There's so many bits and pieces that can cause JavaScript to stop executing. Everything from your JavaScript doesn't get downloaded, the browser runs out of RAM, a third-party plugin manipulates your page, or it crashes and somehow crashes JavaScript for you. A browser plugin injects an element into the page where you don't expect it, and then causes something to fail because the element you were looking for in a particular place doesn't exist. You've, of course, got going through a tunnel and losing network connectivity entirely. And then you've got while the page is loading, too. So in the case of that Ember version on the Nexus 5 over 3G, 5 seconds and not a damn thing is happening. So JavaScript can't be guaranteed. But let's look at so this is my my healthcare dashboard now with my new health insurance. And so this is a single page app, right? The experience of using this is that I load up the page, I get a nice little loading icon, and then it loads up the actual content that should be on the page. So it loads the HTML shell with a header and footer. I haven't tested yet to see if the header and footer can actually be used without JavaScript. They may not be able to. Then it downloads and displays a nice animated loading icon, so I had to wait a little bit to get that before I could even wait to get the JavaScript. And then JavaScript requests the remaining dashboard content and loads it in. But there's no fallback, right? If I don't have JavaScript, I don't get anything. An alternative approach would be just to assemble the first render on the server, right? And then send that along. And then there wouldn't be a step 3. If you have a widget that needs to be dynamic, you could take it over with JavaScript after load and then make it update. But nothing on this dashboard. It's not like they're updating how much I've spent of my HSA or something like that in real time. No, they're just loading up stuff via JavaScript. So this sort of approach, if you're kind of an all-in JavaScript sort of person, can be accomplished with what's in some folks' mind, kind of poorly named isomorphic JavaScript, which is where you're executing the same JavaScript on the client side and on the server side, which you can do with Node. which is pretty awesome. And Airbnb has used this to great effect. And not only has it improved the speed with which they're able to render their pages, it's also improved their SEO. And they have a site that will never break because the server can always send content over the wire, or at least it won't break because of JavaScript. So in isomorphic JavaScript, the server sends a real page. JavaScript then takes over, if it can, to create that single page app experience. And if not, all the links and all of the form submissions and stuff like that just go to the back end just like they always did back under Web 1.0. And it's just the JavaScript on the server side that handles those requests. So it's kind of the best of both worlds. In the middle of all of these interactions that are taking place is either JavaScript or the server, depending on the scenario. But you don't need to go all in on isomorphic JavaScript if your backend isn't Node. You don't want to do that. You could easily use whatever backend you have. I've done it in PHP, I've done it in Ruby, I've done it in Python. You can have the backend and the front end consume the same API. That's certainly an option. It could be an API that you use, that you build. They can both reference mustache templates or whatever templating language you want to use. There are usually parsers for both JavaScript and another language. And basically what it amounts to is having a basic HTML with normal links and forms that post to the server. And then when opportunity allows, you create a sexier experience using what Jeremy Keith refers to as hijacks, where you're hijacking the page and adding in some Ajax-y functionality to enhance that experience. Now, interestingly enough, Tom Dale, again, the guy who created Ember, did a complete 180 on progressive enhancement because he realized that he wanted faster rendering. So he created Ember Fast Boot, and this was from the blog post where he announced that, where he said server-side rendering is important to ensure that users who are not on the latest and greatest can see your content immediately when they click a link. Ultimately, that's what it's all about. It's all about providing a good user experience. So I'm going to conclude with a story, and I realize we're heading up against time here, so I'll try and make it relatively quick. We had a project we were working on for a large financial, or rather investment company, financial institution. And they came to us because they were running into an issue with their apps, specifically iPhone, iPad, and Android apps, and they wanted to be able to upgrade their login, their security, and they were using a web service to do that, and each of the apps was consuming the web service and then rendering the various screens they had to do, et cetera, et cetera. Well, the problem was that they were having a huge bottleneck trying to roll out new security features. They would have to create the new security feature in terms of the web service. They would then have to update each one of those app code bases to include the new screens for that web service and to set up the various logic bits to consume that web service. They would then have to get those apps through the approval processes at the various app store locations, and then they'd have to cross their fingers and hope that their users actually downloaded that update. That could be weeks, potentially. And security is kind of an important thing that you want to jump on right away. So they approached us because they wanted us to reimagine this login flow and all of their security stuff as a web-based flow that they would open up from within the context of the apps. Somebody would go through it on their web server, and then they would dump them back to the app. So we gave them a budget of X to do that project. And we threw in Windows Phone because they were contemplating doing a Windows Phone app as well. So we did some testing there. And so we gave them a pattern library. We built the entire thing with progressive enhancement in mind, even though we were just targeting these 4 platforms, right? And we even gave them theming and such. They came back to us 6 months later and said, this has been great. We want to roll this out to our MDOT site. Here's a list of 1,400 user agent strings that access login in 2 days. Can you support these? 1,400 devices, man, that's crazy. So I wrote a script that basically parsed that list of devices and got characteristics of each of the devices based on the user agent string so that I could begin some aggregation so that I could make this into something that was sane and testable. We got it down to a representative sampling of 23 devices that covered 97% of that spectrum, so that's a little bit more testable. But it included some really heinous stuff like BlackBerry 4 and OpenWave. Some of you are probably not even familiar with OpenWave. It's pretty much dead and gone now, but people still use it on occasion. And so we gave them a budget of 1/3 of the original project to add 1,400 more devices. And we told them that if anything cropped up in that 3% we weren't testing, that we would obviously fix that. We just couldn't find devices for that extra 3% of the things, because they were all, like, you couldn't use them on Wi-Fi, basically, and there weren't emulators that we could use for testing. Miraculously, we came in at half that. We came in at half time and half budget because progressive enhancement just works. And interestingly enough, when we told them this, when we gave them the good news, we were like, how do we cut you a check back? They had no idea how to receive money back from a vendor because it had never happened before. It was pretty crazy. But progressive enhancement just works. It allows us to reach more with far less effort. We later rolled out the same thing to their desktop site, and we're able to use the exact same code base for all of these situations, which was awesome. I'd already told you the story. Don't need that again. So when it comes down to it, we really just need to think about experience as a continuum, starting from something basic that anybody can use, even on something as basic as links, and then creating better and better experiences as we're able to do so. And really, this goes along with what Frank Chimero calls the grain of the web. It's really about embracing the web's inherent webbiness, its ability to go anywhere, its ability to adapt, its ability to fill whatever vessel you happen to try and load it into, whether it's got a screen or not in reality. And that's really what progressive enhancement is all about. So hopefully if some of you had some misconceptions about progressive enhancement or worried that you couldn't use it in your projects, hopefully I've convinced you otherwise. Thank you very much for your time.